Yeah, I don't know. That's a Matt question, I guess. Okay, thank you. Hey guys, my mic is dead online, and that's why I get the handheld. But also gives me an excuse to sit, so that's a win for me. Uh, on a fun note, I went running with my daughter today. Thank goodness it was a slow run for her. Wasn't slow for me, but it was for her. Anyway, it's good to be back. You know, we had our 2 weeks off for Christmas, and then we had our quote snow day, and then we had the service last week. So I feel out of sync. You know, when you're off that long, I enjoy teaching. I look forward to it. It's like I'm out of rhythm. It's like going back to school in the fall. I know there's some schools year-round school system. They go for 18, take off 4 weeks. I would hate that as a kid. I would never get into rhythm. Anyway, I am glad to see you. You guys online, thank you for tuning in. As always, if you have a prayer concern, please email me or let me know before 3. I did want to share with you. I know, like, just you were just Mary Alice was just sharing. Connie had an unexpected procedure. I guess is that what we'd say, but at least it went well. Yeah, so but it went well, so that's a win. And Ray, who usually watches this online, I know uh, his procedure today went well. And I know from the conversations that Blenda and I had before class, and as well as Ray and I had this afternoon, I know that, like Karen, she was saying, appreciated the prayers. I know Ray says he appreciated prayers. He said, I want you to share with your group how much prayer means to you. So I say that when people ask you to pray, yeah, stop, do it. I'll be honest in myself. I found like it's so easy to tell someone like I'll pray for you, but if I don't do it in that moment, I may forget. Now there's certain prayers I just now get to a rhythm, so I work my way through that. But I do. I know personally appreciate prayers myself, and I know my family does. So I encourage you. Prayer is so simple and so beautiful. And you don't have to worry about your text limit or anything or data limit. It's just something you can just say to God. I know we are having a conversation, some of us this week. Prayer is just like I talk to you, and that's what prayer should look like with you in your relationship with God. Anyway, with that said, I think we shall pray. So, gracious God, we are here again to study. And today I was just thinking, you know, the beauty of the word that we call Scripture, and I was thinking about the opportunity that you've given us to study. I was thinking about how the early church spent time in study. And then I was thinking how these individuals here that are online in person have carved out 50 minutes each week because they see the importance of study. So God, I just ask that you bless them. And I ask that the time that they give, it overflows into their other relationships with their family, their friends, and into the life of the church. Just as they may be blessed in this experience, my prayer is that through this experience, they or we will be blessings for others. God, we've heard testimonies tonight of family and friends who just say thanks for the gift of prayer. And God, we do thank you that we can just come to you and just give you the good, bad, and the but ugly. And I just thank you that you're just that open and you love us that much. We can just come to you and bring it all to you. And so, God, just again in this space, give us ears to hear. And for me, as I lead tonight, help me get out of the way and let the things that you want to be said be said. We pray this through your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, I so want to put this over here because I so miss my handheld, my over-ear mic so bad at this moment. The question to me from someone this morning, is that you? Do we have class next week? Again, the only reason we will close is snow, or holiday. But the secular holidays, no, that doesn't happen here. So your bank may be closed, but we won't be closed. We shall be here. So let's drive on. We got to, before we missed the last couple of weeks, we saw Jesus was betrayed. And after Jesus was betrayed, we saw him arrested, and that's where we pick up in John chapter 18, verse 12 through 27. Then the detachment of soldiers and its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him, and they brought him first to Annas and then to the father-in-law Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because this disciple was known to the high priest. He went in with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple who was known to the high priest came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You're not one of the disciples, are you?" the girl at the door asked Peter. And Peter replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and the officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in the synagogues or in the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret, so why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas, the high priest. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "You're not one of the disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Okay, back to verse 12. Again, I've got sections in my Bible. Mine has Jesus taken to Annas. I don't know if your Bible sections off this part that I put into a section as well. But we got to remember, no verses, no chapters, no sections. Why do I tell you that? Because if there was a section, I think 12 would fit really nice in what we just did. You know, wherein Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" You know, in other words, shall I not go my path that is planned? Shall I not face death as I have told you that I was going to face? I say it because 12, even though it's in this section here in my Bible as a part of this 12 through 27 section, I think then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Caiaphas and then the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest. But just that idea, the detachment of soldiers with this commander arrested Jesus. I got a period in the end of my sentence here. I say this because this really could have, you're thinking, "Jeff, you're not an English teacher." Sorry, that's your job. But if I were, I would put this in that last section. You know what I'm saying? It could easily, because it concludes the arrest. And then we get to this next section where we are today, moves us into the interrogation and the questioning by Jews. And we're going to see the questioning by the Romans like Pilate. So anyway, he's led by a commander. They arrest Jesus and they take him to Annas. In verse 13, it's an important verse. "And they brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas and the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people." Okay. Sidebar, not in my notes, but just for something we need to know. You know this whole court thing that's going on, this trial that Jesus is being put through? To me, it's a sham. According to Jewish law, you know, there should have been, you can't be sentenced and on the day their trial wasn't and held. So you're going to see Jesus is going to be sentenced and tried and actually, you know, going through with the trial and, you know, crucified, you know, against Jewish law. So maybe to justify what they're doing, some would say, well, maybe that's why they went to Annas and Caiaphas. I don't know. I also ask, because you've been able to make all this decision without the whole Sanhedrin being there. And I question, was the Sanhedrin really there? If so, where's Nicodemus? We don't hear Nicodemus unless he's just being silent. We don't hear from Joseph of Arimathea. We don't hear from these individuals. Anyway, so it says, first to Annas, and who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Both Annas and Caiaphas had been high priest. I know you watched The Chosen. Some of you else watched The Chosen. Some of you binge watch with me. This season, you have the whole. This is cool when you see that where it wraps up them going in. Both Annas and Caiaphas had been high priests. Annas was the high priest from 6 to 15 AD. But he was removed by Rome. And so they put in Caiaphas, Annas' son-in-law. He was appointed from 18 to 36 AD. So as far as the Jews, and that's why I love The Chosen, you see them defaulting first to, Annas. Because, he was, as far as they were concerned, the true high priest. Now, they go through the motions and use both. Now, again, while the move was made by Rome, some said Rome did this regularly. If the power rested in the high priest, then the Romans, just to control the power, it's easy. Move someone off. Change it with someone like Caiaphas. But still, the Jews, as far as they were concerned, that's why I guess I love the take that The Chosen did on it. And you're getting the backstory, so you'll see why these discussions are taking place. As far as the Jews are concerned, a high priest is one for life. So that's why they're looking for Annas to make those decisions. Anyway, so we see the role of Annas. Annas is the one being interrogator. Annas is the one that's being interrogator, and Caiaphas is the one making the decision. I'm going to give you this, and this is from Gail R. O'Day. Here's what she said. Annas was the high priest from 6 to 15 CE. CE is what I grew up as a kid, 80. 80s now replaced with CE, Common Era. So Annas was the high priest from 6 to 15 CE, but his influence did not end when his term ended. In addition to being the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest from 18 to 36 CE, 5 of Annas' sons, as well as his grandson, succeeded him as a high priest. It is clear from reading from Josephus, the good Jewish historian, that Annas was the most influential member of the high priestly family for the early and mid-first century. Indeed, in Josephus, one finds Annas referred to as the title high priest well after his term had ended, a practice that may have reflected here in John's use of the title for Annas in chapter 18, 19, and 22. Luke also testifies to Annas' continuing influence, for he twice speaks jointly of the high priesthood of both Annas and Caiaphas. Giving Annas' influence is not implausible that he would have had the role of the interrogation of Jesus, and that his role was remembered in the tradition of which the fourth evangelist, i.e. John, had access to. Raymond Brown suggests that the meeting before Annas was more like a police interrogation that immediately follows the arrest of a suspect. And Annas is the role of the interrogator, and there's certain historical plausibility to Brown's presentation. As high priest, Caiaphas would have had the official role of presiding over the Sanhedrin session. I just thought it was interesting. Anyway, that's just Jeff. Back to the text. Caiaphas was the one who, John says, had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man would die. I don't know if you remember this, so I'm going to help us out. We're going to go back to chapter 11. And this is early on when we see that Jesus is starting to get underneath the Jewish officials' skin. And if you remember, because they asked the temple guards to go bring him in, and they didn't, because they said this man speaks with authority, and if you remember that at all. But anyway, they plot to kill Jesus. And in chapter 11, verse 49, then one of them named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, he spoke up. you know nothing at all. Because they were talking about, we have this they were looking at the good and the bad of Jesus. And Caiaphas says, you know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish. In other words, and it goes on, he did not say this as one, but as a high priest, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. Because he knew if Jesus was not taking away, he thought that, in other words, Caiaphas feared as well that Rome would take away the Jewish authorities' leadership. The Jews had limited freedom as long as they kept the peace. And so Caiaphas and the other leaders, they feared that because, Jesus' miracles, his large following, they feared that this would cause Rome to react and to clamp down on them. Now, anyway, back to where we were, back to chapter 18, verse 15. Simon Peter and the other disciples were following Jesus because the disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple who had known the high priest came back, spoke to the girl on duty, and they brought Peter in. Are you not one of the disciples? The girl at the door asked Peter, and he said, I'm not. It was cold. The servants and the officials stood around the fire. They made it to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, twiddling his thumbs and warming himself. It does not say that. Again, if you were with me back in December, what happened to the disciples after Jesus was arrested? They fled, yes. They all fled when the soldiers had come. But here in John's Gospel and in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Peter and another come following Jesus. Because it says Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Now, the other one apparently is one that's known by the high priest. This is how Peter got in. Some would say it was John, the one whom he loved. But John, the son of Zebedee, would not have been known by Annas. So those commentators, that's why I say don't ever rest in the commentaries. Those that'll say it was John, there's no reason for John to have known Annas. So, who was that other disciple? I don't know. I wasn't there. So we don't know. You thought you were going to get the inside. Truth is, I don't know. And those that claim to know, that's on them. So we got this unnamed individual. The unnamed individual goes in and he follows Jesus. Then he comes back to Peter. And as we see, Peter gets on the defensive when he's questioned, aren't you one of the disciples? So again, going back, a disciple is a follower. There were more than just the 12. You guys, you're spending time in study. The hope is you're a disciple. We don't usually claim it. I know some of you as leaders, you heard me talk about the Great Commission, but the Great Commission says what? Go preach, teach, and make disciples. Disciples. We're making disciples here. Disciples, a follower of Jesus. In this case, for us as Christians, we're disciples of Jesus. So the unnamed one goes back, follows Jesus, goes back to where Peter is. Peter gets on the defensive, and then what's the first thing that happens? You are not one of the disciples, are you? And he says what? I am not. I say that because I think I put on your sheet. Did I put Luke 13:37 on your sheet? Nah. I'll kick it right in if you want to. But I love it because, one of the things that Peter said, I will lay down my life for you. And here he is. When he gets put to the point of laying down his life, he says, I don't even know this Jesus guy. Why? Because Peter, he's afraid for his own life right now. And I guess he justified it in his own mind. I mean, sometimes we do that. We justify when we do things wrong. I think he justified it by saying to himself, I got to survive. I got to see what happens. But the thing is, in essence, like I told you, Judas wasn't the only one that betrayed Jesus. All 12 abandoned in essence, going into hiding, they all denied Jesus. So verse 18 says it was cold, and the servants and the officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. So here you see Peter. He's trying to blend in. It's the image of a spring evening in Jerusalem. You know, you're 2,500 feet above sea level. Oh. Hey, Siri, how tall is Mill Mountain? She always answers me at home when I don't want her to. So, apparently, I'm a little bit more than 2,500 feet. But just imagine, you know, the higher up you go, it gets a little bit cooler, doesn't it? I mean, so Jerusalem's 2,500 feet above sea level. And when it's night, you be in that 38 degrees in the morning with sunshine on you. Feels butt cold at night, doesn't it? Right? So even in the springtime, let's assume it's spring, 50 degrees or 55, 60 degrees. You go to who's ever been to a night football game? Everybody in this room probably at least once in their life. 60 degrees feels nice when you're sitting outside when it's sunny, but as soon as it gets dark, that 60 degrees feels cool, does it not? This is Peter. That's what it is. That's the image. You know, it's 25 above sea level. It's night. It's a spring evening. It's cool. So they're keeping warm by this fire. Anyway, we have a scene change. You go from taking Jesus in, scene shifts. It's like watching a soap opera. You go to the fire scene. Now camera shifts. We're back inside with the questioning in 19. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus and his disciples about his teachings. So they're questioning Jesus. And you're thinking, well, why are they questioning Jesus about the disciples? You know, why is Annas so concerned about the disciples? And I think as maybe he just wanted to know what to expect. Maybe he was wondering, you know, how big has this Jesus movement gotten? You know, are there just really large numbers? Would there be, I mean, think about it, a retaliation? You know, we brought Jesus in. Should we expect that there are going to be, you know, thousands of people coming to storm the temple right now? Maybe he just wanted to know, and let's just take it at face value. Maybe he just wanted to know, what is he teaching his disciples? What is the teaching? But here's what Jesus tells them. Jesus is what? I spoken openly to the world. Yeah, maybe YouTube isn't going to come around for 2,000 years, but there were other people in the temples and the synagogues, and they would have heard it. And that's what he said. I was always out in the open teaching. I was in the synagogues. I was in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Nothing in secret. So why question me? Ask those who heard me, like the temple guards. You know, surely they know what I said. Jesus says you could ask anyone, and they will tell you what I taught. And I love this answer because, you know, it makes me think back. Do you remember the guy that was healed by Jesus, and they brought him, and he was blind? And you remember all that conversation that the blind guy had with the Pharisees when they're investigating it? And then the Pharisee finally, the blind guy really just gets frustrated with the religious leaders, and he says, I've told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples? Remember, that made them mad at the blind guy. Remember, they threw him out of the synagogue. But I see that same thing. You know, they got angry with the blind guy, and now they're getting angry with Jesus. In fact, one of Annas' officers, they think that Jesus' answer, they think Jesus is being a smart butt here. They see Jesus' answer as a sign of contempt. So they just basically take an open slap, and just jack slap Jesus. And they says, why do you answer the priest that way? I mean, that's it. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. In this way you answer. Is this the way you answer the high priest? Now, the truth is, Annas isn't the high priest. Annas was the high priest, but like I said, you can still see that tension when you watch The Chosen, how Rome can say Annas is not the high priest, but the good Jews and the Sanhedrin say, well, yeah, we're going through the motions. He really is the high priest. So Jesus defends himself. If I said something wrong, testify to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, which he did, why did you strike me? Jesus defends himself. For the truth is, he had been slapped unjustly. There was no reason. I know it's just a slap, but it was no reason for that to take place. He had spoken the truth. I say this, and I want you to hold your finger here, because as a follower of Jesus, Paul himself had something very similar. He's before the Sanhedrin in chapter 23, verse 2 and 5. Paul's right before the Sanhedrin. He says, my brothers, I have fulfilled my conscience in God and all conscience to this day. And at this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. You know, it's chapter 23, verses 2 through 5. What? Acts. Yeah, Acts, sorry. But I was just saying that, I look at the life of Paul, and you think that's a rabbit trail, but no. You see a lot of similarities in what took place in Paul's life, or any follower in the early church, what took place to Jesus. Paul's before the Sanhedrin, and he's spoken up. He's told about Jesus, and they bring him in before the Sanhedrin, and they still smack him upside the mouth for speaking the truth. Jesus is defending himself, and he gets smacked upside the mouth. And then, of course, Annas sent him still bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. It's funny, you got high priest Annas, high priest Caiaphas. As far as the Romans concerned, Caiaphas is the only high priest. As far as the Jews are concerned, Annas is really the high priest. But we'll listen to the Romans, and we'll pretend we're going along with them, and Caiaphas can be the high priest. But anyway, they take him. After Annas' interrogation, Jesus is sent to Caiaphas. Caiaphas, as far as Rome is concerned, the true presiding high priest. Now, if I were teaching you the Gospels, like Matthew, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, we would hear Caiaphas' interview. But this is John. John doesn't give us anything. We're going to go back to the courtyard, and then it's going to be right before Pilate. But if I were teaching, like I said, in Mark, which we'll do next, Mark does give us, and if you don't mind, because I want you to get the full picture, go with me to Mark chapter 14 for a second. So this is the rest of the story, the part that John leaves out. In chapter 14, verse 53, this is Caiaphas' interview. They took Jesus to the high priest and the chief priest, elders, and the teachers of the law. Peter followed him at a distance and right into the courtyard. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself. The chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for every evidence against Jesus so they might put him to death. But they could not find anything. Many testified falsely, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony. We heard him say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another, not made by man. Not even their testimony did agree. Then the high priest stood up before Jesus. We're going to say, this is Caiaphas. Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men bring against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest, Caiaphas, said, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, coming in the clouds to heaven. And the high priest then tore his clothes and said, why do we need more? We have heard his blasphemy. Anyway, so that's the Caiaphas one. Now, back to where we were. Chapter 25. So we've gone from chapter 18 of John, sorry. We've gone from arrest to courtyard to Annas' questioning. Back to courtyard we go. Back to the courtyard. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "You're not one of the disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." Peter's still in the courtyard. He's by the fire. He's warming himself. And again, Peter's asked the question, "You're not one of the disciples, are you?" Which he says, "No, I'm not." Either way, whether it was his accent, when you look at the other Gospels, they'll say, "Are you not with the Galilean?" They questioned perhaps his look. They questioned his accent. He draws attention with his answer. Because then you have another one that says, what? One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "I heard your voice. I've seen your face. Now you look familiar. Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" Again, Peter denied it. In that moment, a rooster began to crow. The third denial, just as Jesus had said, "Before the rooster crows, you will have denied me 3 times." Now, clarity, if I were teaching you Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the other 3 Gospels say the 3 denials happen in a fire, outside a fire that was in the courtyard of Caiaphas' palace. John has it outside of Annas' house. Most likely, and that's why I love my Bible, most likely they shared the same courtyard, so it's one and the same. I love also in Luke's gospel, it's what if you're familiar with it, we have the rooster crowing, and what happens in the other gospels? Peter, he remembers the words of Jesus, and he weeps. And it reminds us how hard it was on Peter. It's something he said he would never do. He would never deny him. He said he would lay down his life, but Jesus says, you'll deny me 3 times this very evening before the rooster crows. And Peter realizes that he had done just that. Anyway, continuing on, 28 through 37. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early in the morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would have not handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews objected, "But we have no right to execute anyone." This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you King of the Jews?" "Is this your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priest who handed you over to me. What is it you've done?" And Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent any arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. And Jesus answered, "You're right in saying that I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born. And for this I came into the world, to testify the truth. Everyone on the side of the truth listens to me." Okay. Side note, in the Gospel of John, Jesus' last meal with his disciples is not explicitly stated as the Passover meal. Remember, we just had the foot washing. Unlike the synoptics, again, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it said, we had the Passover. The synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, say Jesus ate the Passover meal with his disciples before his arrest and the crucifixion. John John suggests that the Passover occurred the night after Jesus' death. Going back here, it says they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Gail R. O'Day, the 20th century commentary, here's what she says. In John, Jesus' trial before Pilate occurs on the day of the preparation for the Passover, the 14th of Nisan, not the car, which the first Passover meal is eaten. Whereas in the Synoptic Gospels, again, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it occurs on the 15th day after the first Passover Seder had been celebrated. But note, verse 28 makes it clear that the Passover meal still lies in the future, and the trial begins in the morning. Now, as I say this, Gail mentions things like Nisan, 14th and 15th day. So I think I put on your sheets, did I? Please say comparisons. No? I stink as a teacher. You need to go in other classes. I'd go to Warren's on Wednesday. Let's compare it. So when let's just do Nisan, for example, since I didn't put it on the sheets. My bad. Nisan was a month that lasted for 30 days. 30 days. And that would have been under the Hebrew calendar. So when we think about the Gregorian or the Julian calendar, which we're under, this period of Nisan would be March and April. That's why you see us always celebrating, the Passover as well as what we consider Easter during that period of time. Again, in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is depicted on dying on Friday, the day before the Sabbath, because it would begin that night. So how do you reconcile this? But that's jumping ahead. But I do want to reconcile it some because it always bothered me. How do you get this? So I'm going to read this. What day did he really die? Again, I wasn't there. It says, there's one great problem in studying the fourth gospel, which we did not take note at all. This is from William Barclay. He says, here is a note. He said, only note on it briefly, for it's really an unsolved problem on which the literature is so immense. I mean, we could spend days arguing on when did he actually die. He said, it's certain that the fourth gospel and the other three give different dates for the crucifixion. They take different views on what the last meal together was. In the Synoptic Gospels, it was clear that the Last Supper was the Passover and that Jesus was crucified on Passover Day. It must be remembered that the Jewish day began at 6 p.m. on what is, for us, the day before. The Passover fell on the 15th of Nisan, but the 15th of Nisan began on what to us would be the 14th of Nisan at 6 p.m. Mark seems to be quite clear. He says, and on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover, his disciples came to him and said, where will we go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And Jesus gives them the instructions. And then Mark goes on to say, and they prepared the Passover. And when it was evening, he came with the 12. And, that's when they went to the garden and prayed. Undoubtedly, Mark wished to show that the Last Supper as the Passover meal and that Jesus was crucified on the Passover day. And so Matthew and Luke follow what Mark had. On the other hand, John is quite clear that Jesus was crucified on the day before the Passover. And he begins his story of the last meal. Now, before the feast of the Passover, it's back in chapter 13, when Judas left the upper room, they thought he had gone to prepare for the Passover. The Jews would not enter the judgment hall, lest they should have been unclean, and that would have prevented them from eating the Passover. That's what we read here in John. It said, by now, to go into Pilate's house, the Jews did not want to enter the palace because that would have what? Made them unclean to eat the Passover. So, there seems to be a contradiction that there's no compromise or solution. Either the synoptics are correct or John is. And like Barclay says, scholars are much divided. But it seems most likely that the synoptics are correct. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I say, oh man, I don't want you to think, what day did he really die on? And he said because John was always trying to find some hidden meaning. In his story, Jesus is crucified as somewhere near the 6th hour, being the time when the temple and the Passover lambs were being killed. But far likeliest thing is that John dated things in order that Jesus would be crucified at exactly the same time the Passover lambs were being killed. so that he might be seen as the great Passover lamb who saved his people and took away the sins of the world. It seems that the Synoptic Gospels are right, in fact, while John is also right in the truth. What is that in English? Throw it aside. I could give you all my commentaries, and they're going to disagree. I think they're both right. How are you going to say that? I do think it was after the Passover, and I do think, as John says, Jesus was the sacrificial lamb, the once and final sacrificial lamb. So I think John is giving us a picture of what Jesus was, and I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke are giving us the actual time it happened. That was a 5-minute rabbit trail, sorry. Anyway, let's dive in, verse 28. So here we are, early morning again. They're at Pilate's gates. The Jews had led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid again ceremonial uncleanliness, the Jews did not enter the palace. Why? The palace. Why? They wanted to not be unclean, so they could eat the Passover again. So John's got us looking forward, but most likely it's occurred. Anyway, so you see, they're there. They're coming to get Roman permission to crucify Jesus, and it's inconvenient. But it was a requirement because they could not kill Jesus. It was against the law for them to do that. Now you're going to say, well, what about Stephen? They stoned him to death. What about the lady they brought in, who committed adultery? They're going to stone that person to death. But anyway, those I think were spur of the moment things. But under law, only the Roman authorities had the ability to execute someone. The flip side, if the Jews got Rome to execute Jesus, who looks like the bad guy? The Romans do. So it's like passing the buck. They could shift the blame, and they could blame it on the murder on the foreign occupiers. So picture this. They're eliminating one threat. Jesus, these are religious leaders. Again, I'm being fun. Religious leaders, they're eliminating one threat. Jesus, and guess what? They're framing another. They're setting up Rome. Anyway, back to 28. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning. To avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Again, under Jewish law, entering the house of a Gentile would cause that person to be unclean. They would not be allowed to take part in worship in any form of the temple. They would not be allowed to be a part of the celebrations until they were made clean. And so because of this, John says they just stay outside on the porch. They stay outside the house. They're probably in the courtyard or on the porch. Pilate has to come to them. So, again, 29. So Pilate came out and says, what charges are you bringing against this man? He says, is he not a criminal? We would not have had to bring him over to you. But Pilate says, well, take him yourself, judge him. It's your own law. So Pilate, let's just sidebar for a second. Pilate, I know we talk about Pilate some. Pilate was the governor in charge of Jerusalem or Judea from 26 to 36 AD. Pilate was unpopular with the Jews. And if you're watching The Chosen again, it's one of those sidebars, you can almost miss it. I don't know if you remember seeing him putting an aqueduct in front of the temple. And that's why Pilate was unpopular, because he was using temple funds to put in an aqueduct to get a clean water source. Pilate resided in Caesarea, but he came to Jerusalem during major festivals. And guess why? It's to handle the riots, to handle insurrections that might take place. Why? Passover is a big deal. Remember, we talked about it. Anywhere from a couple 100,000 to 1 million people came to Jerusalem at that time. So he's there. Now, truth is, Jesus has been on the scene for 3 years. I'd like to think, and that's why I love The Chosen, I'd like to think Pilate knew who Jesus was. I know there's no social media. I know there's no major networks, but I still think word of mouth worked even in the first century. I'm pretty sure Pilate knew about Jesus. Or I would like to think, since Pilate's in Jerusalem and you had this whole triumphal entry, a couple of days before, that thing we call Palm Sunday, I'd like to think that Pilate probably heard about this dude that's creating this stir. So, but still, he asked the question, what's the change? Why are you bringing him in? Aren't you guys the Jews in charge? And their answer is basically, hey, Pilate, you should know why we brought him here. You gave us soldiers. Remember, we looked at it when we had the temple guards and this whole mob, but in the temple mob, we also had what? We had soldiers. We had a whole cohort of soldiers, remember? A detachment of soldiers had come with the chief priest as well. So they basically throw back at Pilate and says, you know why we're here. You gave us soldiers to arrest this guy. If this man were not a criminal, also, would we not have just handed him over to you? And now, Pilate, he could care less. And that's why, again, he could care less about Jews. He could care less about the constant squabbling among Jews. Because that's what he saw, when he would see the Sadducees and the Pharisees arguing. To him, he probably thought it was comical. These Jewish groups could not get along. And as far as he's concerned, this man, Jesus, had been arrested. Yeah, maybe I did give you soldiers to arrest Jesus. Wasn't that enough? I got him arrested for you. He's off the scene. Can't we just end it there? Basically, he says, he's a Jew. You deal with him. But again, remember what they're trying to do? They're trying to what? Frame Rome. They're trying to frame Rome. So the Jewish leaders, they persisted, and they gained Pilate's attention by insinuating that they had found reasons of their own law for Jesus' execution, as well as possibly Roman law as well. Example, if we were studying Luke, in Luke's gospel, one of the things they would tell Pilate is, we have found this man subverting our nation. He has told us to pay no taxes to Caesar, and he claims to be a king. We're not studying Luke, so we don't see that, but we do see that. And under Roman law, again, I got to remember, Jews are not sanctioned to carry out. But I'm going to stop right there because I know it's that time. We're going to pray. We're going to pick up in verse 31 when I come back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. And again, I thank y'all for coming. Thank you for carving out time just to learn. Have a good night.